Yes, we're
All
live.
right, so for those who may not have been near a service before, I'm holding the goddess Caffeina. This is the international drink of you use every place in the world. We're sleepy people. Okay, so greetings. I'm lay leader Jon Dreazen. I also masquerade as a physician from time to time as well. But today I have this other role, and thank you. Technical issues. Thank you very much. Here I really am. Good. No problem. Sure. If I knock it off, it'll be just an expense to the congregation. And I can actually see myself there. Good. All right. In case I'm not sure what it'll look like. Anyway, on that note, welcome to the service this Sunday, October, check the watch, 3rd of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown. We are thrilled. We are masked, but we are back in our sanctuary for the first time in a very long time. It kind of feels like coming home. We are a free and open community. We welcome anyone who comes through our door, as long as they adhere to the inherent worth and dignity of all people around them. We don't care if you're white, black, purple. We don't care if you're gay, lesbian, or other. We accept you unconditionally, and that is our faith. Do we have any announcements?
Hi, I'm Linda. Hopefully you can hear me through the mask. Yes. Okay. First of all, giant cards. So I will be placing the order for October. For those of you who do it regularly, if you want to change your amount, let me know. If you want to join in, let me know if I can place an order for you. The other thing that, if you need an incentive and if you're on that type, both giants, the one on Upper Potts Grove and now the one in North Coventry, if you need a little beer or wine to go with your dinner, you can use your giant card to do that. So rather than going to the liquor store and buying it, they've got a very nice selection. You can buy it through Giant and we get the 5% off of that. So anyway, yeah, really. So if you want to join in on the Giant train, let me know. The second is we are here through the efforts of some amazing people, and there are two I really want to call out. The first of which is, if you get a chance, look at our back sanctuary. Emily and Mary painted those. So we now have this beautiful, would you call it purple, blue theme that's now going through the entire sanctuary and building, and they painted some of the things that we had there. And the second is a special thank you to Mary, because she mapped out the seats to keep us socially distant, put the little tape down, set the chairs up, and did a lot of work to make this as safe as possible for us. So thank you, Mary.
We also thank Rick Dusky and his wife for the technological advances. We've come into the 21st century, sort of, and we thank him. It's been hard work to now move everything from the outside to the inside. I have a laptop next to me, which thankfully I will not have to use today, because that would be beyond my simple and humble means. So we'll begin, as we do in all of our services, with a chalice lighting. And we'll see if we can find ourselves a chalice later. If anybody wants to help themselves, there should be a candle here. Thank you, Mary. So the chalice lighting is number 450. Blessed is the match consumed in the kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the heart's secret places. Blessed is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honor's sake, which is appropriate to my sermon. Blessed is the match consumed in the kindling flame. Okay, for those who have the hymnal, which is also have our readings, we're going to have a responsive reading from 442, entitled, I think appropriately, We Bid You Welcome. So I will begin. We bid you welcome, who come with weary spirit seeking rest. come with hope in your heart. We bid you welcome who are seekers of a new faith. We bid you welcome who entered this hall as a homecoming. Whoever you are, whatever you are, wherever you are in your journey. Okay, so I was going to have Carly play this, but she could not find the music. So hopefully, I love the Hallelujah song by Leonard Cohen. I have something which is from the U.S. Air Force Sergeant's Band. So let me see if I can make this happen. I think it's a lovely incarnation of it. Give me a moment here, because again, even small technology is challenging for me.
A secret chord that David played, and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do ya? Well, it goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift, the baffled king composing hallelujah.
I'm going to leave it there. It's a lovely tune. It goes on for about 5 minutes. The U.S. Air Force singing sergeants produced that piece of it. There are others who have it. I love the lyrics. I love the music. It's just a source of hope and joy. And on that note, it's time for the sharing of joys and concerns as a caring community. This is part of our spiritual nature, the support of each other. So please step up to either microphone if you have a joy or concern you wish to share with the congregation both here and on Zoom.
Hi, I'm Kay. Is this on? I have a concern. Albert is still in lockdown. We couldn't pick him up this morning. They are now not allowed out of their rooms. He has his computer, but the sound is terrible. So I thought maybe we, or I don't know, could furnish headphones for him. So maybe that would help. He does watch us on YouTube. And I also have a joy that Judith's here this morning, and thank you, Trish, for bringing her.
Okay, thank you for that joy. We are celebrating our eldest members and the fact that they are with us in spirit, if not in their physical presence. So now I have to deal with the issue of when one makes one's, I'm not sure what I lost there, when one makes one's order of service before one does one's sermon, because the reading I have is buried in my service, and I will come back to it, but I will read it in a short part here. I'm not a part of the American Medical Association, because I don't think that they stand for what I believe is the best of the best, but I'm going to read their view of medical ethics. They are, by the way, not in favor of euthanasia, and I'm going to read the whole document later, but I'm going to say here, instead of engaging in euthanasia, physicians must aggressively tend to the responsibilities of the patient's care at the end of life. So ponder that thought for those who go to doctors who are part of the AMA. I'm not sure if they adhere to this or not, but that is the ethic of that, and I will come back to that in more detail in my sermon. So our first hymn, I'm not sure if we're singing openly or not, but if not, it's a hymn I love very much. It's one of our martyrs, Norbert Capek, who was a Unitarian minister who was, at the time of World War II, safely ensconced in a church in Newark, New Jersey, but felt a calling to return to his home country in Europe. He unfortunately was rounded up by the Gestapo for whatever alleged crime back in about 44, and he perished in Auschwitz not long thereafter. So hymn 8, Mother Spirit, Father Spirit. From this, because I can imagine a man in desperate straits. I don't know the date he wrote this, but he said, Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, where are you? I can imagine a man in Auschwitz wondering that fact. I'm sure many of the people incarcerated did think that way. He also has one of the great lines, I think, dreams eternal, fears infernal, haunt my heart. The duality, it to me is chilling. So my next reading, which I'm going to grab in here, is actually from the UUA. And again, I'm going to read a portion of it, as I'm going to come back to it in greater detail in the body of my sermon. So I'll read the last piece of it, which I will repeat, which came out of the 1988 General Assembly, where they state that believing that it is every person's inviolable right to determine in advance the course of action to be taken in the event there is no reasonable expectation of recovery from extreme physical and mental disability, be it finally resolved that the Unitarian Universalist Association, acting through its congregations, memorial societies, and appropriate organizations, informs state legislators to support legislation that will create legal protection for the right to die with dignity in accordance with one's own choice. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my sermon. Bear with me. I had a choice of handwriting my sermon, which was unappealing since I brought in many different chunks of stuff from other sources. I had the choice of typing, but that wasn't so appealing because although I can type, I type like a snail, and I feared a lot of errors there. So I went with the third choice, which wasn't so great. I went to my office and used Dragon voice dictation, and as you can probably see from my pages, everything that's handwritten is what the machine made errors in doing. When I went through this last night in my garage, reading it in a sense to my wife, it was garbled because it kept on hitting errors and kind of stopping and stumbling over there. So I went back and wrote in what I thought I was trying to say. Imagine my medical notes. So it's fun to read down after the fact and say, what the heck was I trying to say? It's a technology which I hope will get better. Anyway, good morning and welcome to my thoughts with regard to euthanasia. I'm a physician, so this is not too far away from my heart and soul. Rick, I hit something on the...
That's okay.
There, so we're still working, thank you. Anyway, so as you may note, entering the Sojourner, which was intended to be provocative, as you may note, I said, well, we're really calling murder euthanasia or suicide euthanasia and trying to butter it up with a nice term as a way to defend murder. When you give a lethal dose, or someone gets a lethal dose of a chemical, which we assuredly will give them if we're trying to help them end their life. Certainly, if you look at society in general, people will call this mercy killing. There's many names attached to this, but the word killing is still there someplace. And I'm sure that all of you today will have a diversity of opinions, which is why I've left some time when I'm done to allow everyone to air out their thoughts. If we all sit here and have no thoughts about this, I will scratch my head. Where you views, of course. I think nobody was sitting on the fence on this one. So I thought we'd begin, as I think is appropriate, to frame my discussion by looking at our principles and purposes that guide us and are the core of our faith, although we're not rigidly bound to them. 4 of them make some sense to me as we think about things. 1, the famous inherent worth and dignity of every person. 2nd, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. 3rd, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And finally, the right of conscience, which certainly needs to be involved in something as delicate as end-of-life issues. Now, you should understand that we're the only organized religion of the 16 that I came across that in any way condones or supports the concept of end-of-life measures such as euthanasia. And I'll come back to the Catholic concept, which is interesting, but they do not morally accept euthanasia, nor does my original religion of Judaism, nor any of the Protestant faiths. So we are unique in many ways, and this is just one more way that we are unique. So let me go back to this and talk a bit more about the General Assembly in '88, which was far before its time. And they made the comment that they passed a document called The Right to Die with Dignity. And you can look it up in its fullness. I only excerpted certain parts. But it says, guided by our extended, bear with me here, this is stuff I've written in, guided by our beliefs in Unitarian Universalism that human life has inherent dignity, which may be compromised when life is extended beyond the will or ability of a person to sustain that dignity, and believing it is every person's inviolable right to determine in advance the course of action to be taken in the event that there is no reasonable expectation of recovery from extreme physical and mental disability, be it finally resolved that, and as I said before, acting through our congregations, memorial societies, and organizations, we will inform legislators to support legislation that will create legal protection for the right to die with dignity in accordance with one's own choice. As you're probably aware, this document and people in Oregon from our faith were the impetus behind the first state in our country, I do believe, to have legislation that allowed for euthanasia in that state, and that has gone on to other states, as I will describe. And of course, we all have the obligation for our own free and responsible search for the truth. And again, I think people will have opinions about where that begins, where that ends, with regard to one's own life and taking of one's life, if necessary, at the end of life. So with regard to physicians, and we have at least one retired physician here. So as you may be aware, when you're a medical student and you graduate, you then will get your diploma, but you will also recite the Hippocratic Oath. Now, whether it was written by Hippocrates or not, I think is in the midst of time. But there's an important passage that I intoned many years ago, which says, referring to the patient under my care, I'll keep them from harm and injustice. I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to that effect. Pretty chilling. He would believe, or whoever wrote this would believe, and we've said for centuries, that we won't do this as physicians, be involved in euthanasia, which is kind of the implication. But nowadays there is what's called the modern Hippocratic Oath. It was written by one of my mentors from medical school in the University of Rochester, but before he came to, and I'll talk to him about his name in a second, it's a bit humorous, he was the dean in 1964 of the Tufts Medical School. That's significant, I think, because Tufts was a medical school and a university founded by our faith. I don't know that it helps a medical school function differently, but it is interesting. This gentleman's name is Louis Lasagna, and that is his name. When I was in medical school, he was a great pharmacology professor, but a wise man. And he said this, and this is the same portion revised. He said, "Most especially must I tread with care in matters of life and death. If it is given to me to save the life, all hail. But it may also be within my privilege to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. Above all, I must not play God." I'll come back to the concept of doctors playing God or something that may approach that from time to time. Now, he has said that, but as I said, I'm going to talk a bit more about the AMA's point of view about this. I read a portion of what the final comment was, but they do have a document for which they stand, and says, quote, "Permitting physicians to engage in euthanasia would ultimately cause more harm than good. Euthanasia is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as a healer, would be difficult or impossible to control, and would pose serious societal and ethical risks. Euthanasia could be readily extended to incompetent patients and other vulnerable populations." And so, as I said before, instead of engaging in euthanasia, physicians must aggressively tend to the responsibilities of the patient's care at the end of life. So, again, we have a back and forth here as to what we as physicians are directed to do at the highest level. Now, back to the concept of playing God. We couldn't have a discussion of euthanasia without going back to Jack Kevorkian, who in his time was, you may recall, known as Dr. Death. Dr. Kevorkian was an anatomical pathologist. He was not a clinical physician, but he developed a great interest in seeking remedies for end-of-life suffering and how to do this with compassion. So he developed what he called his death machine. You may recall that little machine, a contraption where the person pushes a button. It's kind of like a Rube Goldberg concept, and the person having been hooked to an IV would receive different doses of medication, which would inevitably prove to be lethal. I don't know what his mix was, but it certainly was an effective technique for the 130 plus people that were euthanized under his control. There were many legal efforts, as you can imagine, to stop him 3 or 4 times. There were cases brought against him. They were all overturned or they failed. However, he made one final, I would call it a misstep or an error, which is that in all the other cases, the person had the control. They pushed the button, the infusion began, and the person succumbed. So therefore, they were making the choice to push the button. In the last case that he was involved in, he himself administered the lethal dose. That's when they got him on murder charges, because they said, well, you gave this person this drug and you killed them, and our state doesn't allow that. So he was taken to jail. He served 8 years out of 25 before being released, and he was prohibited, of course, from ever doing it again, as you can well imagine. Now, the problem was, and as I read articles about him, and this is where he may have also slipped up, he was in a sense, the judge and jury. He was not doing psychological evaluation. He was not having a second physician or practitioner verify and validate what he was doing. There were thoughts that some people may have been not mentally as competent. They could have been depressed, which could be remediated. Just was felt he didn't do a good job of choosing the people that were euthanized. He was interviewed in 2010 by Anderson Cooper on CNN. And the question that Cooper asked him was, "Are you saying that doctors play God all the time?" To which he answered, "Of course. Anytime you interfere with the natural process, you are playing God." I found that interesting because I've spent 41 plus years, I guess, unexpectedly playing God. Why? My wife doesn't like this whole statement, by the way, but I will say as a physician, I've obviously prescribed many medications, and one could make a case that any of these interventions could qualify for divine status, or my divine status. But it is what we do as physicians. It's the question of what you're giving the patient, what the outcome is, and I'll come back to that, because it's all about intent and causality and what you're heading for in your administration. Obviously, as I will say later, I've never been involved in euthanasia, and obviously, therefore, everything I've done has been hopefully for the benefit of the human being, not for their demise. Now, to make my life complicated, euthanasia is not, in and of itself, a clear description. So, There's voluntary euthanasia, which is conducted with someone's consent. A person says, you know, I'd like to end my own life, and someone provides them with the means, and they have full voluntary consent, and they want to do what they want to do. It's legal in Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, and currently, if the article is correct, in the states of Oregon and Washington. Now, it's interesting, in the foreign countries, the physician administers a lethal dose, and they are legally protected from any harm that may come to them. I didn't go into great detail, but there are different techniques. In some countries, you tell the physician, the authorities in advance, that there will be a death at this site, and they come later and a pronouncement is made, and the physician is not implicated in the process. But, you know, it's a slippery slope. And so obviously, even in these countries, they're trying to dance around the fact that the physician is involved in ending a life, but will not be held accountable in the legal sense. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go back, you know, when did the concept of euthanasia begin? It is said by a historian that Emperor Augustus was described as wanting to die quickly and without suffering in the arms of his wife, experiencing the euthanasia he wished for, and that may be where perhaps the first use of the term came from. So it is defined as a painless inducement of death. Painless is important. People should die in comfort if one is going to even embark upon this, and I'll talk about how that can be made to happen. The Oxford English Dictionary, always a good source for definitions, incorporates suffering as a necessary condition with the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease or an irreversible coma. Now note, the definition says killing, and that's where we get into the whole concept of euthanasia, because there is killing. Someone is going to die, and the question is, what does killing mean in terms of intent? It's not like you took a gun to the person's head, but the outcome is still the same, and that's kind of where we have to dance around this issue a little bit. And the other thing about euthanasia is intentionality, that the death must be intended and not accidental. And it must be a merciful death. Now, you can argue what merciful death means, since it's still killing and it's still death. But among the main definitions of euthanasia will be the comment that this is also called assisted suicide with the intention of causing death and in the end point. And again, this is emotionally charged. Is the patient committing suicide? Is the physician abetting and aiding death? You know, that is to be morally determined. I would also note that in the states where, and the countries where euthanasia is allowed, there certainly is a very rigid process. It's not like the physician gets to decide, I think I'm going to do this. There's a vetting process that goes on, so the physician, unlike Dr. Kevorkian, is not working by him or herself independently, so there should be a better selection process when we get to that. Now, of course, there's non-voluntary euthanasia, which is a person who is unable to consent due to their current health condition. It's presumed that the decision was made by another appropriate person on behalf of the patient based upon the quality of life and suffering. I'm not so sure that a living will, others can help me with this because I didn't get that far in my research, where you can put in your document that you're allowing someone to take your life for you when you can only make that decision to do that. You can withhold care and write things down as we may have done in our living wills and advance directives of what you don't want done. That's kind of a very passive approach, as it's called, as passive euthanasia, as opposed to active. But, you know, I'm not sure that it's legal to have someone else make your decisions for you. And it's finally the most ominous type of euthanasia, which is called involuntary, when one puts a person to death without having consent or against their will. That obviously, you know, we know where that goes. That goes back to Nazi Germany and many other places where people were just simply murdered. And that was not really euthanasia, but they have put it in the rubric of involuntary. Kind of a bad choice, I think, because euthanasia, by definition, means good death from the Greek. So here are the arguments that are for euthanasia. So the ideas are people should be able to make a choice. It is, after all, your life. The only person who knows how they really feel emotionally and physically is the patient. Every person should have the right to die with dignity. That many people feel that slow, painful death is not humane. And that it's really okay that a person should be allowed to end their life earlier than would otherwise happen if that's where they're going to end up anyway. You know, it was inevitable. Inevitability is there. And there's also the other half of it, against that, which of course are many, but physicians don't want to violate the Hippocratic Oath, or perhaps the AMA doctrine. There are many moral and religious arguments against euthanasia. It can be morally unacceptable, as suicide is in the same category. The euthanasia is only voluntary if the patient is mentally competent with a lucid understanding of the options and consequences. And people get a little whiffy at a life. Are they really able to make a clear decision? The patient may feel that they were burning up resources and may feel pressured to consent because of the financial burden on the family. Given our American medical system, one can imagine when your bills start to hit $100,000, you kind of say, well, you know, I couldn't be living longer, but I don't know that that's really going to be the right thing. And the final argument, by the way, for euthanasia is, I forgot this before, you know, this is kind of interesting. So we liberally, in a sense, allow our pets to be euthanized. We feel that is the right thing to do with our canine and feline brethren, but we don't think it's okay for humans. And I guess if we believe that we're all living creatures of value, you know, why are we different? You know, why are we so special? So, one thing that's interesting, you can ponder on this, they did a Gallup poll and found that weekly churchgoers, 55% were in favor of taking the life of a person who was terminally ill. 87% of people who didn't attend a religious institution or church were more in favor. So, I don't know what to make of that. You can ponder on that. That's just struck my brain as being curious. Now, this is interesting. When I first went on the staff of St. Joe's Medical Center back in '83, and since that time, and although it's owned by Penn State, it's still heeding the Catholic ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services, which we all must adhere to, and there are things you can't do. For example, you can't have an abortion at St. Joe's, you can't have your tubes tied at the hospital, and the residents are not allowed to provide any contraception. So they still have to obey certain parts of the doctrine, but there's some good parts. So let me read you parts of their doctrine, which I think are very enlightened, but will not approve euthanasia per se. They kind of dance around this. So first, and these are quotations, the duty to preserve life is not absolute, for we may reject life-prolonging procedures that are insufficiently beneficial or excessively burdensome. It goes on to say that, however, the following line says, suicide and euthanasia are never morally acceptable options, so ponder that. But then it says that the task of medicine is to cure even when it cannot cure. And moreover, it says two extremes must be avoided. On the one hand, the insistence upon the useless or burdensome technology, even when the patient may legitimately wish to forego it. And on the other hand, withdrawal of technology with the intention of causing death, which would be passive euthanasia. It goes on, and again, I'll talk later, this is a lot of moral philosophy built into this. A person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration become morally optional when they cannot reasonably be expected to prolong life or one that would be excessively burdensome to the patient. Kind of seems to contradict some of the earlier lines I just quoted. And it does say, a free and informed decision made by a competent adult patient concerning the use of the withdrawal of life-sustaining procedures should always be respected and normally complied with. So it's okay if the person makes that decision, but somehow maybe the institution can't make the decision. You see what I'm saying here? These are dancing back and forth along a thin razor, basically. Then it says that the patient should be kept as free from pain as possible so that they can die comfortably and with dignity. Now the next line, I think is a key line. Medicines capable of alleviating or suppressing pain may be given to a dying person, even if this therapy may inadvertently or indirectly shorten the person's life for as long as the intent is not to hasten death. That is the moral principle of double intentions. And again, there's a lot of moral philosophy built in here which would make my head hurt because I did have a philosophy class when I was in college, and I hated it because I'm a medical person and nothing was ever clear. It was a lot of cloudiness. But again, you could have an ethical discussion about how they came to these ideas and how they're dancing back and forth between what the church can morally accept and what the church cannot morally accept. I will tell you that, and this was kind of the pulmonary specialists got me into this, because they would have people come in with metastatic lung cancer to the bone, which I will tell you is incredibly painful, as the cancer is expanding the bone and causing horrible pain, which is basically incurable. You can palliate it by doing different things, but the person is going to be in horrible pain, and if they reach that point, they're going to die. And we would accept that with chemotherapy or not. So it was routine in the hospital, and this struck me as odd. This is the first time I really had to come to grips with this. They would write an order for a morphine drip, so many milligrams per hour, ongoing, and also the order that the patient or the staff could administer additional doses of morphine every 5 minutes for control of pain. Now we know that morphine in high doses will cause apnea or cessation of breathing, and ultimately will hasten death. But that was acceptable and was done, not infrequently in this institution. So you can wrap your head around how we're dancing around the issue of, are we really doing euthanasia and hiding behind an immoral or ethical principle? Ponder on that one. So, it's time to wrap up. I want to leave you with these thoughts, that the literature has many, many other ideas which are complex and induce headaches. Just keep in mind that in the US, when we euthanize people, we give them a very potent dose, probably of a barbiturate, which does two things. It puts a person to sleep, and as they are going to sleep, they will stop breathing, and they will, of course, succumb. That is the usual method of doing this. So that is actually what we're doing. The question we have, obviously, what about the people who can't make a decision? They're not physically or mentally able to administer the dose themselves. Late-stage Alzheimer's, we've all experienced that in nursing homes, people who are just living in kind of suspended animation, hopefully without advanced feeding techniques to keep them alive forever. People who may be on artificial ventilation and have no hope of ever having that stop, such as people with Lou Gehrig's disease or end-stage lung disease, but they may hate their life. They probably can't express their wishes to us. And you probably can think of many other examples of people who probably would merit, if you will, or would love to exit life at that point, but are unable to themselves administer lethal medication to make that happen. So there are no easy answers to this, but I will tell you that as a practicing physician, although I personally have never been involved with issuing or ordering lethal dose of medication to my knowledge, I felt a great deal of contentment to help patients adjust to oncoming death with peace. I felt very contented if I could help their family adjust to this fact as well. To me, that is my best sense of what I would call euthanasia. And aside from ordering doses of morphine in the fashion I mentioned to you with painful metastatic cancer, I personally have never been comfortable with, nor have ever been involved with ordering a lethal dose of medication for a patient to administer to themselves with the sole thought that they will end their life at that point. Maybe I'm a chicken, but that's kind of where I stood on the matter. So that concludes my different thoughts. There's a lot of stuff I was trying to get into this discussion. It may have been a bit choppy at times. I apologize. I'm hoping I've planted enough seeds in everyone's minds that they may have some thoughts or opinions on the matter as it pertains to themselves, their families, their own life experiences, or their intentions of the future. And so with that, I open the floor up to anybody who wishes to offer a comment. We can make the mics work. Our moving mic has some static in the background, so please come up if you're able, or I can move the microphone to anybody who needs to be heard.
Can I pull this down while I'm up here? Is that okay? Okay. Thank you. That was really, really good and very, very thought-provoking. I had that situation with my father where he was dying of a glioblastoma, and I know as a nurse we'd always check people's respirations before we gave them morphine because it does that. And the nurse came in and he was having a lot of pain, and she said, well, I could give you morphine, but it could stop his breathing. So actually facing that personally, I realized what a decision that is. The next thing I want to mention is that it's such a complicated issue because everyone is so complicated. I remember when Jack Kevorkian was first coming on the scene, all the people he killed were women. And a lot of people said, what is this about? You know, are we taking into effect that there are more social pressures on women, that there are fewer options as women age? So it's such an incredibly complicated issue. And I thank you so much for bringing it up to us. Thank you.
Just an editorial comment. She mentioned the term glioblastoma. Excuse me. Glioblastoma, of which there are at least 4 stages, is a nasty tumor in the brain. It tends to be relatively incurable, although we're getting a little bit better at it. But when you have part of your brain that's been co-opted by this chunk of tumor, it, number 1, destroys brain. Number 2, it expands what's left of your brain in the cranium, which has no give, which tends to cause major issues. So just to understand and frame what the concept of glioblastoma means.
This made me remember when my father had pancreatic cancer, and he died at home, and he had a morphine drip, and he, you know, was a feeding tube, and everything was going through it. And Mom and I, we had a nurse that came in, but Mom and I were there, the only people there at night, and so we knew how to, they said, okay, this is how much you can put in, this is how often. And so we would give him the morphine drip. At this point, the last couple of days, it wasn't touching him. I mean, he was in so much pain. But what we did was, we didn't give him any extra. It never even occurred to us to do that. But what happened is the next morning when the nurse came in, the first thing she did was to take that morphine vial. Because I was like, well, what did you do that for? And the reason was she was going to test that vial because she knew how much was in it and how long we'd had it, and she was going to make sure we hadn't given him an extra dose. She was unaware that I had an entire unopened vial, which ended up being a rather long, crazy story. And so, but that was the first, like, oh, why is she, oh, she thinks we may have helped him die. And then the second was when my mother passed away a few years ago. She got pneumonia, and she turned down going to the hospital where they could, and I talked to my sister, she's with a doctor, sister's a doctor, and she said, you know, she can go to the hospital, I'm sure they can get her well, she'll come back, but we're on a limited amount of time here, as we know. She does not want to go at all. She just wants to stay here and let nature take its course. So that's exactly what we did. I said, it's her choice. You know, I would have preferred she go to the hospital, but that was being selfish. And so we're like, okay, this is what you want, you go. And she had the most peaceful passing you could possibly have the next day.
And that, I think, again comes back to euthanasia, a truly good death, passing in peace with families surrounding you. I'm not sure we can ask for more. I personally would prefer to go abruptly, by the way, and not deal with the problem at all. But that may not be my karma coming forward. And a quick comment about cancers. You know, people, unfortunately, as the years pass, have this misconception that medicine has solved all problems. Cancer in particular, we've done very well with our modern biological medications. We're finally getting to the immune system, and that's kind of where the core is. But it's kind of, you know, number one, about location. Some cancers, like glioblastomas, pancreatic cancer, which is buried deep in the body, ovarian cancer. There's some cancers that we're just not at this time going to find early because you just can't get there in time. So we will continue to have to deal with people who have stage 4, high-stage cancers for which medical science is not yet there in terms of extending quality of life or life at all.
Hi, Linda. When my mother passed away, she had Alzheimer's. I was taken down. She had Alzheimer's, and before she had any inkling that she would have Alzheimer's, she wrote a living will that we thought was perfectly clear, but when it was scrutinized, it was perfectly vague by the medical community, one of those. But what she did say was, do not hospitalize if I am not of sound mind. And clearly, she thought she was 6 years old, so she was not of sound mind. So the argument between my sisters and myself, there's three of us, it was not really an argument, but a disagreement, of whether or not to honor do not hospitalize. So the first time she had a heart issue with a slow sinus rhythm, so she would fall asleep. And the facility she was living in said she has to go to the hospital. This is our policy. So what we knew was we had to find a facility that would honor do not hospitalize if something happened. So we really had to look, because most places say if something happens, they're going to the hospital. They're not staying here. So we did find a place that would put her in hospice. So 3 times she had this sinus rhythm where she would fall asleep. They would say, okay, she's going to die now. And they put her on hospice, and then she wouldn't die. And, she would come back and live like 6 or 9 more months. But she was still thinking she was 6 years old. And, so she finally did die peacefully, so to speak, because she just fell asleep. But it was her way, this do not hospitalize, was her way of saying, don't extend my life. Don't give me those extra measures. And we're kind of glad that she said that, because it made it clearer to us, at any rate, what she really wanted.
And again, I get the chance to make additional comments along the way, but one, it's such a shame, I never really dealt with my parents having living wills. This never occurred to me as a physician that they didn't have them. So my father was in a nursing home for the last 5 months of his life with a variety of maladies and debilities, and apparently his catheter got clogged and he had a huge accumulation of urine, so he was taken to the hospital to deal with that, and that day after he was there, he sustained a heart attack, abrupt death, no doubt a heart attack. They did CPR, they failed, and the doctor called apologetically that my father had passed away. So, I feel very foolish and regretful, although the quality of life he was leading in the nursing home was certainly nothing he wanted. So I don't know if that was the good Lord's will somehow to end his suffering, but I feel badly that I never really thought ahead of time about those thoughts. The second thought is, when I was a nursing home medical director and had many people in a local nursing home, my policy is I would not agree to take care of a patient unless they had a living will, because I just felt that it was foolish to do CPR on a person. If you do CPR correctly, as my mentor taught me, he'd say, how do you know you're pushing hard enough on the chest? He'd say,
You break your ribs.
correct. You have to actually hear the ribs breaking. So if the person survives, which by the way is not likely, because the success rate is about 3% or 4% with an AED, the person's going to wake up in horrible pain with what's called a flail chest and every rib broken, and on and on and on. So I morally did not want to have to take care of people, send them to the hospital for conditions that were not, where they were not going to be helped by doing that. Not to be nihilistic, but just to be compassionate. And my final comment is, I see we have one child here, and one of the most painful things that a parent may ever have to do is to come to the same decision. We all think of the aged and the infirm and the elderly, but unfortunately, again, in my career where I've had kids who have had advanced cancers, some of whom were cured, some of whom succumbed. And obviously, that's one of the most horrible parental decisions I can imagine, because you wouldn't have a living will for a child, and they can't make their own decisions legally, so that's up to the parent to decide when to so-called pull the plug or how end of life will transpire at that point. And we haven't discussed that, but I just remember that that is, unfortunately, an occasion that has to be dealt with.
So it's interesting, and I'm glad to hear the perspective from a physician and a nurse, because the death of my parents, even though it took place in the same place, so they had moved to a retirement community in Whitehorse Village, which is where the ministers live. Lovely community that has everything from independent living, where they had started, memory unit, and then a skilled nursing, right? So towards the end, if you can't take care of yourself. Mom ended up in skilled nursing. She had just one day, didn't quite wake up. We think this is it, and so it was a Friday morning. By Saturday night, she had passed, but they were giving her morphine. She was just sort of in a coma, and they were giving her morphine to help with the breathing. At the final stage, because her breathing was becoming apneic, and you can tell that it gets really difficult breathing, the nurse comes in, and they were giving her morphine. She's like, I just wanted to see if she needed more morphine. And the hospice chaplain was there. And I looked at him, and I looked at her, I said, I could take my cat into any veterinary breathing like this. And they're going, oh, we need to put her down. To make a long story short, within an hour, my mother had passed, whether it was the additional morphine they gave her or it was her time she had passed. What is interesting is in the year and a half before my father ended up there, they had change in the DON, the director of nursing, and there was a major turnover in the nursing staff. So we went from nurses who were very happy and very eager to keep my mom comfortable to my father, who was now admitted because he had developed a abscess that was in his lower spine that had spread. So he had just a massive infection. He was a 92. He ended up in Paoli. They said, you got two choices. We can try to do surgery, and he had lost use of his legs because the infection and the abscess was just weighing on the nerves. We can go in and do surgery. Can't guarantee we're going to get it all out, and can't guarantee you get your legs back, or it's palliative and we just sort of let it ride. My father was lucid enough, and I thank God, or the higher power. He said, no surgery. This is it. I'm done, I'm ready. Okay, fine. We put him on hospice. We take him back to his room at White Horse Village. Now, mind you, he is in agony. He is in pain. He had prescriptions and dosages that would have put him in a war down. And yet, these nurses would not proactively give him his meds because they didn't want to be the one that potentially OD'd him. And you need to understand that my father pretty much, when he said he was done, he was done. He didn't eat or drink. So we were looking at 7 to 10 days until he eventually died. And I had to sit there, not because I wanted to sit there, and I did, but because I had to ride these nurses to say, are you going to give him his meds? That was agony for the family. Not so much that our father was dying, but we had to ride the medical community to go, can you keep him pain-free? And then towards the end, you're like, this is no life. Why can't I take him to a vet and say, put him down? He's dying. He wants to die. He made the decision. Let's do it. So I am sort of passionate about this. And I have some struggle with the medical community who's like, I don't want to give the final dose. Then why are you working in a skilled nursing facility that deals with old people? So that's it.
And a comment about that, there have been studies done in the past, I can't speak to the current time because I go back a very long time, that show that when doctors prescribe analgesia, they underprescribe. And in the old days, Dave can remember this, we used to be able to give a range, give this much for mild pain, moderate pain, or severe pain. We really can't do that because the Nurse Practice Act then says that the nurse is making a medical decision. But when we could do that, inevitably the other half took place. The nurses would underdose. They would not choose to give enough. One of the more latent concepts I encountered in my medical school years, I was doing a surgical rotation. I was an English surgical resident. And for every post-op patient, this is before patient-controlled analgesia, you couldn't push a button. You had to push a button, and if any of you have had surgery, you may have encountered this problem. You push a button, I need pain medicine, either it's too soon, or the nurse is busy. And he or she doesn't get there for a while, and you sort of suffer. Now, the patient controls analgesia, puts it in your hands. But back then, it didn't exist. So what he did, knowing this happens, he would prescribe a fixed dose of injectable morphine every 4 hours for 48 hours. The patient could refuse it or defer it, but it was on the books for the first. He said, they're going to have pain. This is abdominal surgery in general. We've cut them open. They're going to have pain. Why should the patient have to beseech the nurses for what they need? This way, the nurse has to come and follow my order for those first 48 hours. It was a very latent approach to pain control. We still have a stigma in this society about the use of narcotics. Yes, the Purdue Frederick Company should go to some very dark place, and they shouldn't get away with a settlement because of the way they promoted OxyContin. But that black cloud should not interfere with correct use of analgesia, going forward, I would hope. All right, so I got the last word there. It's a privilege of this. So, if one of you could do me a favor and extinguish the chalice. And we have in our order of service our usual words for extinguishing our chalice if you choose to read along with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the gift of wisdom, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again. And the closing words I also like very much because this fellow, L. Griswold Williams, back in the 1930s, was a minister of the First Review in Reading. He was apparently quite the speaker. If you ever see his picture, he has a very dramatic thespian face, mustache, beard, piercing eyes. And he apparently had people coming to that then Universalist church, and they were packing the rafters because of his oratory skills. He also, by the way, began the Reading Players, and they had their first performances in the church, which had a stage at that time. But I love this final reading, so it's 471, and I think it applies to us as well. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Go in peace. Shalom. Namaste.